Hey everybody, it's Daniel here from the Breakdown Show, and today's guest is Matthew Dennison. Matthew Dennison is the author of 8 critically acclaimed works of nonfiction. She's a journalist and a broadcaster. Matthew's latest book is titled The Queen, an elegant new biography of Her Majesty Elizabeth II. For millions of people, both in Britain and across the world, Elizabeth II is embodiment of monarchy. Her long life spans nearly a century of national and global history, from a time before the Great Depression to the era of COVID-19. Her reign embraces all but 7 years of Britain's post-war history. She has been served by 15 UK prime ministers from Churchill to Johnson, and witnessed the administrations of 14 US presidents from Truman to Biden. The vast majority of Britons cannot remember a world without Elizabeth II as head of state and the Commonwealth. You can get Matthew's latest book on Amazon, The Queen, an elegant new biography of Her Majesty Elizabeth II. If you want to support the Breakdown Show, go to breakdownshow.com and donate to the PayPal link. You can buy our merch. You can always subscribe to any podcast platform. That's iTunes or Spotify or Stitcher, or you can simply subscribe and watch our videos on YouTube. Don't forget to donate to Save the Brave. Go to savethebrave.org. We fight together, PTSD. All right, enough of me. Enjoy Matthew Dennison.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick
This
Marotta.
is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Matthew Dennison, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Hey, man, I appreciate you coming on the show and talking about your fantastic book. This thing's big, like 500 pages or something. And it talks about the life of the Queen, obviously the Queen of England. I'm interested, there's been so much written about her. Why a new book? What space was left to fill?
What I really wanted to do was reach some kind of assessment of the Queen as practitioner of monarchy. And yes, there have been a lot of books about the Queen, but there have been a lot of the kind of books that take the things of the corgis that don't necessarily get to grips with what's really going on. So I was hoping that at this point in the reign, as we approach the 70th anniversary of the accession, which is obviously a landmark, but also a record in Great Britain, that this might be a time to take the long view and a long assessment of exactly what the Queen had done over the course of her reign.
I know queens and kings are supposed to rule for life, but at some point, you're in your 90s, even if you have vim and vigor, it's remarkable if you do, but is it time at some point for, and I'm not saying this queen, but any monarch to step down and say, it's just, my nation needs more out of more than I can provide with my age. I mean, I'm not saying that for this one, but in general, can you outlive your usefulness and relevance in the monarchy world?
Well, of course, that has happened in monarchies across continental Europe. I think that's the only way she would abdicate is if she had a stroke or suffered from Alzheimer's disease. So in some way was both mentally and physically incapacitated. And here is the deal. Elizabeth II is, I think, the only anointed sovereign on earth that alone the British monarchy retains this quasi-medieval coronation service in which the monarch makes a binding sovereign, a binding promise rather, in a God's presence. And obviously, if you believe in God and you have a strong religious faith, as our Queen does, then a promise made to God for life is a promise for life. I think also what's key here is that, what do the British people and the people of the Commonwealth look to the Queen for? Well, at this point in her reign, we don't look to her for energy. She seems capable of mustering the energy needed to do the things that she has to do, like her meeting with President Biden at the weekend. She symbolises so much more in British life than dynamic force, although in her story, she is a dynamic force. So in her case, at the moment, albeit there have been questions since, I think, the 30th anniversary of the accession in 1982, following the marriage of the Prince of Wales to Diana Spencer, about whether she would resign and abdicate in favour of her son. I don't think there is a significant groundswell of British opinion in favour of the Queen stepping aside. And I think there is a wide understanding that she probably won't.
And ultimately, I mean, I guess it's her decision, right? If she feels like she's able to contribute and is reasonably healthy, she is sworn in for life. So why not keep going?
I think so. Although, the only caveat I would add to that is that what has she done and had at the forefront of her thoughts? Well, this idea that she is a kind of guardian of monarchy, a safeguarder of the crown. So I think if she thought her aid would somehow jeopardize the security of the throne, at that point, I think she would step aside. But the British love an old trooper. We love people who go on and on. So there is no need on grounds of age for her to step aside.
Yeah. She's lived for so long and reigned for so long. I mean, it's generations. It's just outside of the norms of history. Yes, there are other people that have ruled for a very, very long time, but in the modern time, she's experienced quite an advancement. Air travel has completely changed. Now we have space travel, which is apparently becoming, so routine that we're going to have moon bases maybe in her lifetime, and she's in her 90s. It's remarkable that she's been as resilient and capable of remaining relevant, given the internet, phones, and everything. We're talking internationally over a computer. None of this stuff was even possible even 30 years ago,
I guess there's a number of things going on. In the late 1960s in Britain, people began to say that the Queen, who hadn't markedly shifted with the seismic social changes of the 1960s, could at this point become a symbol of continuity and endurance. And that which was probably seen as a bad thing in the late 1990s and the early 60s became a positive in that turbulent decade and has been a positive ever since. It is the case that monarchy has evolved during the Queen's very long reign, but evolved, I think, imperceptibly. Undoubtedly, if courtiers from the beginning of the reign came back, they would think there had been a considerable lessening of formality, that there was greater accessibility, that connections between crown and country were greater. But most people haven't really noticed the changes. And I guess, why is the Queen relevant? Because she continues to embody values that the nation endorse. Most of us don't practice these values to nearly the same extent that she does.
It also seems like she has an ability to adapt with the times. It may not be as fast as people in the press or the populace wants, but she's able to. I remember when Princess Diana died, and it was, is the flag going to fly at half-mast? And it took a while to get that sorted out. But now that's sort of forgiven because she does make these leaps ahead. She does progress into what is a more socially tolerant time, I suppose you would say. And that, I think, is to her credit, but she has to move as fast as the crown can let it. And this is an American asking kind of a question. The crown moves at a different speed than other things do. So how does she, as the crown, meter how fast she moves on certain issues or advancements?
Well, I guess the question that she would continually ask is, what change is necessary? The crown is not fashion. In Britain, fashion hasn't been set by monarchy for 300 years. The point about fashion is that fashions change, and you're always in danger of being left behind if you are associated with a particular fashion. Monarchy needs to be timeless. It's the significant difference between a royal and a celebrity. A celebrity is a person of intense interest to the public for a short period of their lives, and then the public lose interest. It's absolutely key that the public retain lifelong interest in members of the royal family because the role is a lifelong one. So my feeling is that in the same way that the Queen is above politics, she's slightly above fashion. It is no longer the case that in Britain people look at the Queen and necessarily see themselves reflected. People don't dress like the Queen, they don't speak like the Queen, but they do see a reflection, a very positive Britishness in her. And I think across the Commonwealth, those nations that retain the Queen as head of state recognize her kind of deep affection for those nations and the sense in which she always does her best to put them first.
What does someone like the Queen do with their life in general? I mean, does she set goals? Is she trying to accomplish things? I mean, obviously she's got a busy day-to-day life, but how does she look ahead? 5-year plan or whatever it's going to be. How does she even process that with all that she already does?
Well, of course, her working life involved looking ahead because her diary is planned months and sometimes years in advance. She made a visit to a newly independent African state in the early 1960s and wrote a letter to a Greek friend saying that she was astonished by the outlook of the new president of this new nation, in that he didn't look beyond his own lifetime. And the Queen, who of course sees herself in this long continuum as the 41st English sovereign since the Norman Conquest, doesn't have the option of only seeing things in terms of her lifetime. So I think throughout her reign, there's been this double perspective, a focus on doing the day-to-day job to the best of her ability, and also enjoying it. I must say that she tries to enjoy every single day, but also an innate understanding that this is more than one person's life job. This is the continuity of a millennium-old system of government in this country.
That's interesting. And I guess the same kind of question, for Prince Charles, because he's been waiting, to do whatever it is he's going to do. And so your life is sort of always in limbo, right? And you have to try to decide what kind of person you are. And I don't know how much of a mentor the Queen is to him, if that's even appropriate or anything, but how does he manage that? And how does she manage that? Because it's hard you can't just be a mom because you're also the crown, you're also the boss and everything else.
Yeah, I think there's a significant things going on here. One is that there is a popular idea that the Prince of Wales must be a deeply frustrated man because he is in his early 70s, still waiting for his life's work. But of course, he's made his life's work, or a sizable chunk of it, as Prince of Wales. And I don't think it is an unfulfilled life. No Prince of Wales in British history has done as much positive good for the nation as this Prince of Wales, and he's had a degree of freedom to maneuver that he won't have when the top job comes his way. In terms of the Queen mentoring, it is very clear that the Queen regards herself as a monarch in the mold of her father and her grandfather, and really until quite late in her reign, even in the early 1990s, she was referencing her father's example, although fewer and fewer remembered her father's example. And key to the example of her father and her grandfather was the idea of what constitutional historians now call a welfare monarchy. So a monarchy that is at the centre of philanthropic endeavour in Britain. And obviously the key concepts there are duty and service. And what would the Queen argue she'd passed on to her children? Well, duty and service. And actually the astonishing work carried out by the Prince of Wales and the Princess Royal would suggest that, yeah, they have absolutely taken that on board. So that there is clear continuity through the generations, more so than I think journalists sometimes argue.
And I suppose that leads to the question of, if, let's say, the Queen has another 10 years in her, does at some point, does Charles just say, it's just not fair to the people to have this double transition because I might be too old soon? I mean, is there a reasonable scenario where he just steps aside and lets his son take over?
Well, of course, that would be up to him. Abdication is a heavily charged word in the British monarchy because the Queen has not forgotten the abdication that brought her own father to the throne, and the very significant wobble that the institution had at that particular moment. It is also the case that for a hereditary monarchy, where eligibility to be sovereign is based on primogeniture, it's dangerous to challenge that principle from within. So I think if, as a member of royal family, you suggest that there can be choice in the business, that's a dangerous street to go down, because if you can choose, then perhaps other people can choose. And if they choose, they might not choose you. So I don't know is the answer. Obviously, it would be Princess Charles's choice. It would require an act of Parliament. It would require Prince William's consent. Who knows? But in British history before now, we've had this pattern of long reinforcement.
And then I guess the other example would be, when in the late 70s, early 80s, when we had 3 popes in fast succession because Pope John Paul I passed away, I don't know, not even 3 months in, how does the crown, and we don't want to wish ill on anybody, but if a similar scenario plays out, is that equally as damaging as someone, saying, hey, abdicating along the way? Or how does the country, the nation, the monarchy in general, how do they tolerate something like that if there was a lot of catastrophic change?
Well, I guess we haven't had that, have we, in British history? But the deal with the British monarchy is the king is dead, long live the king. Yeah,
right.
The crown never dies, which is why the Queen resisted the lowering of the royal standard over Buckingham Palace after the death of the Princess of Wales, because the standard hadn't been lowered for her father, and she didn't anticipate it being lowered for her because the crown remains alive. So obviously, it would be, it would be a period of upheaval. Having said that, I think if what we're talking about is elderly people dying, then that's not traumatic. It can be upsetting, but it's not traumatic, is it?
Yeah, I mean, I until it is, right? Like, it's not in theory, but yeah, you never know. And then what about, when you're the head of state, you go through a lot of catastrophes, through the years. Whether it's we had 9/11, and that shakes the foundation of the nation. A tragedy like Aberfan, when the coal cones collapse, is someone in their 90s capable of rising to the occasion for something as calamitous as that might require some, physical effort? You think about the coronavirus stuff, and obviously that's not her main job, but remember our governor here was hoarse, and you could see he was just exhausted from just trying to deal with this impossible thing. Is that something that she just puts off on somebody else who has more capacity? Because she's got a whole family. It's like, lean on, hey, Charles, I need you to cover this for me.
Well, yeah, I guess here's the deal. Remember, what the Queen doesn't have is power. She doesn't have power like any kind of political representative. The point at moments of crisis is for the Queen to be a sort of conduit for national emotion. And in terms of the coronavirus, well, what did she do? Well, her coronavirus broadcast attracted 24 million viewers, which is a huge viewing figure for British telly. It, for example, is 1 million more people that tuned into Diana's Panorama interview that was said to have broken so many records. So because the Queen has moral authority, because she commands extraordinary respect, because there is this kind of bedrock of deep affection for her, what she does at moments like that is to be a kind of mouthpiece, but also to be a voice of reassurance. And what did she do with the coronavirus? She gave people reassurance, and it was doubly effective because she's one of a dwindling number of survivors of the wartime generation. And although the Queen didn't make a connection with the war, there was a lot of talk at the time that here we were entering something that resembled a Blitz-like scenario. And so I think to have somebody from this rather tough, gritty, ramrod-backed generation, of whom we have fewer survivors, was potent in itself, but also somebody who actually rose to the occasion. It was one of the great speeches of her reign, and it absolutely did the business, and it was projected on huge billboards on an empty Piccadilly Circus at the centre of London. So she's still got it,
Yeah, and I want to kind of close out this section of the show talking about the current Queen and the future and all that kind of thing. But I definitely want to get into, and it's one of the fascinating things you've written about is she had 3 basic confidants: her mom, her sister, and her husband. And now they're all passed. And then you also talked about how, she used her dad as an example. I think a few minutes ago you said this as well, all the way into the 90s. But now there's really no one on earth more qualified to do her job than her. Doesn't mean that she can't take advice on certain issues, but she is the job now. I mean, she is the example. She's done it longer than anybody. So when you look at all of this, how does that being alone impact her? Or is she ever truly alone? And who does she confide in? And who can she get counsel from on the hard things?
Well, of course, what we factor into here is that sovereignty is isolating. She has been isolated by dint of her position from 1952. And at the end of the day, even her mother, her husband, and her sister at some level treated her as the Queen. A key facet of the Queen's upbringing was self-control. And, at the time in interwar Britain, among aristocratic and upper class families, self-control, what is sometimes described as stiff upper lip, was considered a cardinal virtue, that total grip on your feelings and responses. And although that is not fashionable nowadays as an approach to life, and certainly not as a kind of emotional solution, it is a very effective solution to being in this position where it is virtually impossible to confide fully in anyone. Having said that, there is so much evidence to say that the Queen, who is personally a very modest person, will take guidance. She takes guidance from her prime ministers, from her private secretaries, from her courtiers. Does she take guidance on what it means to be the Queen? Well, she doesn't need guidance on what it means to be the Queen, because she has been the Queen through 7 decades and has an innate understanding of the business of monarchy handed down to her from her formidable grandparents and her slightly cuddlier parents.
Yeah, I mean, when you say 70 years, it's mind-boggling. It's completely mind-boggling. I mean, she did go through World War II. She watched her dad, and then she became this figure that is largely not in control of her own life. There's a lot of things she just can't. She has no normalcy in her life. I mean, obviously she does what she does to take care of her family and everything, but it is a pretty interesting position to be in for so long. Not allowed to retire, really. It's maintaining a social calendar. People talk about their grandparents like, oh, look, they're so adorable. They go out and they play pinochle with their friends and bridge, and she doesn't get to be that lady ever. It is a lifelong, and it sounds like she's a hardworking lady. How many hours a week do you think she works?
Well, of course, she going out. But then there's also so she's reading government papers every day when Parliament is sitting. She receives paperwork that, for example, the Prime Minister doesn't receive because she receives paperwork from the Governors General across the Commonwealth. So, she is effectively working. It's not retirement. Having said that, it is the only life she knows and has ever known. Her entire life has been lived within palace walls. She doesn't have experience of what we might call everyday life. At the 30th anniversary, a newspaper commented that her life had been blessed with every privilege apart from privacy. And I guess simply something that she's used to.
What would you say? I mean, you've done the work to look into her life, and I'm curious what your point of view and what you think her answer would be. What moments is she most proud of? And when you look at your Queen and you say, this is when she was the most queeniest and really so impressive.
I don't know what she would say, and I don't think she's somebody who is in the business of giving herself pats on the back. What she says that she particularly values are her palace investitures. We have what's called an honor system in Britain where people are given awards, and the awards were instituted essentially for voluntary work. So, for example, somebody who'd been a postman in a rural area for 40 years in order to have gone up and down a mountain delivering letters, or people who've worked for St John's Ambulance and done voluntary work in hospitals, that kind of thing. The Queen regards that as one of the most important things that she does, that delivering of pats on backs to other people. Those people who have made a positive contribution to community, because the Queen is keen on community and social cohesion. I don't know if she has done things, but there must be moments when she has given a speech. There must be moments when a banquet has gone well, when a diplomatic reception has gone well, when the reception of an ambassador, when an overseas tour has gone well. There have been diplomatic triumphs when the Queen's intervention appears to have turned things around. I guess what she would presumably consider one of her great achievements is the nurturing and binding together, but also huge scale growth of the Commonwealth. that agglomeration of 54 nations scattered across the world that in many cases are remnants of empire. But unlike empire, it's a voluntary coming together. And really, so many of those countries didn't need to be part of this. But yet, it now represents a quarter of the world's population. And they clearly see positive benefits in it. And my understanding is the fact that they have chosen the Prince of Wales to succeed the Queen, though the title of Head of the Commonwealth is not hereditary, is a kind of ultimate endorsement of a pretty unflagging efforts on the Commonwealth's behalf.
One of the problems we have here in the United States is our leaders, the hallmarks of a great statesperson, building consensus, having a moral compass, all these things. We are terrible here, and maybe by design. We are terrible at consensus, right? And so our leaders will say, I'm going to build consensus. And then the next thing you know, they're like, I've got a mandate to change everything. Everybody loses their mind. And I suppose on the parliamentary side, that's probably largely true for you guys. But why is the Queen so magnetic? I mean, look, we love her here too. We don't want her on the wall of our bank and everything like that. But we are absolutely obsessed with the Queen, the royals, and all that stuff. How does she manage to build this consensus? I mean, 70 years she's been doing the job, but you can be a non-consensus builder for 70 years. What is she?
Yeah, I mean, unlike a politician, she has no agenda for crafting change. Change in royal terms needs to be invisible so that they can remain the still point at the center of the vortex. It's also the case that the Queen has been oyster-like in terms of expressing personal opinions. If you don't express opinions, then you don't offend people. And part of what she has done is this avoiding of giving offense, because then she can be a queen for everybody. Because your British society is transformed in 2021 from what it was like in 1952. We are now a multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multilingual society, which we emphatically weren't to nearly that degree 70 years ago. And it is very difficult for one elderly woman to embody a concept of nationhood for so diverse a society. But one way the Queen has done that is by obviously seeming interested in everybody, not prioritizing any sector of British society above another, and also clearly valuing cohesion. We don't know what the real nature of her relationship with Mrs. Thatcher was in the 1980s, but the line was always that Mrs. Thatcher's very combative approach to politics was at odds with the Queen's approach. The Queen's approach is to put oil on troubled water. Mrs. Thatcher liked nothing more than a fight and row. But I think, we appreciate that the Queen actually represents tranquility. Why do people love her across the globe? Well, because she is untarnished goods. The image of the Queen on the British postage stamp in 1967 by a sculptor called Arnold Machin is the most reproduced work of art in human history. And yet, despite the fact that she is the most famous woman on the globe, at some level she is also the least known, because we have very, very little idea of what's going on inside her head, apart from the fact she likes racing and corgis. But of course, that untouchable quality, it's extraordinary in an age of the internet and social media that she remains remote in a very good way. I was astonished, for example, when President Trump used Twitter as a political platform. That seemed to me extraordinary, that you would shrink political rhetoric to 140 characters. And you can't imagine the Queen resorting to that sort of thing, apart from for the most anodyne comment about some aspect of good works. So I think the fact that she doesn't expose herself, therefore means that the currency stays high. And there is a kind of specialness in this untouched, unknown quality.
My question to you then is, I want to kind of come back to this in another way. You are such a diverse Commonwealth, so many different countries electing to come in, but the diversity thing, diversity is the opposite of unity, right? And so it's the same kind of question, but how do you create something that is so diverse and yet can be so British, be so singular, be so unified? And that's definitely a dance that we're not good at here. We'd rather just fight and yell at each other and call each other names, So the unity versus diversity thing, over the last 70 years. How do you what's your opinion on that?
Do you mean in British life or in the Commonwealth?
Well, in the Commonwealth.
Well, I guess the key to the Commonwealth, when the Commonwealth first evolved, it was referred to as the British Commonwealth. And then the word British was dropped from it. And I guess you can be different. There can be diversity, but there can be shared aims. And the overriding Commonwealth aim of wanting to create a better world for world citizens, but also that kind of sense that the richer nations on earth will do their best to help the poorer nations on earth. Well, that seems to be a universal aspiration. I think key to the Commonwealth is that although there have clearly been times when British politicians and perhaps the Queen herself have rather hoped that some countries that were once imperial possessions would join the Commonwealth, joining has always been voluntary. There's always been an element of consensus. Now, that doesn't mean there have been deep divisions. There were deep divisions about apartheid in South Africa, for example, and the British government in the 1980s decision not to impose sanctions on South Africa when Black African nations did that. So there have been moments when the Commonwealth has reached crisis point, and the bonds of union have seemed very fragile indeed. But I think what holds it together now, well, is the sense that there is shared purpose, that this kind of coming together can make a better world, should make a better world. I think there is an element also that shared respect and affection for the Queen is also a kind of glue in the Commonwealth.
And I'm curious, what would you say of our relationship between, the Great Britain as a whole and then the United States? I mean, we tend to pick fights, and we're like your drunken brother. Like, hey, we're going to go fight all of Iraq, all of the Middle East. Will you come with us? And we co-opt Canada and New Zealand and Australia, all of our cousins and everything. We all go over and do that. Are we a good partner, or are we kind of a pain in the ass?
Well, obviously, I couldn't possibly comment. No, I don't know what Americans think. It certainly is the case that in Britain, the idea of the special relationship is not simply something that politicians utter once in a while. I think we do have a sense that there is a special relationship between Britain and America, whilst recognizing that we are in many ways very different countries with very different outlooks. It's a difficult juggling act for British politicians, because when there is a sense that Britain is becoming a kind of poodle to the United States, then there is considerable unhappiness in Britain. And certainly when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, there was a lot of adverse comment about the extent to which he appeared to jump when the USA snapped its fingers. And so certainly in Britain, we would consider that it is a special relationship, but one that should be characterized by mutual respect and mutual independence. And that was a key bit, it seems to me, in the film Love Actually, was the film that Hugh Grant gave as Prime Minister when he said that it mustn't be a bullying relationship despite the disparity in power.
And then how does the Queen deal with these things? I mean, she's seen so much now. I mean, been through all these different prime ministers, and obviously her power in this case is limited, but her influence is powerful. So when she looks at this, I mean, is she just along for the ride, or how does she? I mean, look, if you're a prime minister and you're not taking some mentoring lessons from the lady, you're crazy, because she knows so much about this. She's seen it all,
I guess, again, it's that long-term view, isn't it? That, prime ministers, presidents, they all come and go. Archbishops of Canterbury, they come in, they go out. And there are numerous instances in the history of the Queen's reign where perhaps the Prime Minister has come into office and felt they just know best, and the Queen is a kind of quaint sideshow, and there's an idea of just paying lip service. And then I think they come to value the nature of their own personal relationship with her. But also, they get reminded of the importance of crown power as part of executive power in Britain. That the crown is a key stopping device in British politics. In theory, it acts as a force for moderation. It prevents any one person gaining too much power. It prevents a military coup. It prevents the overthrow of democracy. All of those sort of things. And I think people recognise and value that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I hear what you're saying. Is there any value in the fact that the U.S. has such a big military machine that you guys can spend less money on military stuff, or do you all still fight about how much? I mean, we can never decide how much we want to spend. We just always want to spend more, right? And so you don't have to have a massive Navy. We'll do it for you, right? Like, we have this crazy, again, drunken brother spending habit. But do you guys feel like that's a benefit to you to be allied with us because we have so much material, or is that not really a benefit for you?
I truthfully don't remember that being a significant factor in these discussions in this country. In recent decades, we've had ongoing and continuous defence budget cuts in Britain, which consistently make people nervous. And I think whatever our relationship with Europe, whether we were part of the European Union, or of course now we're not part of the European Union, that there is an aspect of Britishness which is identity as an island state. And as an island state, you feel both vulnerable because you have frontiers on all sides, but also you feel slightly impregnable because there is a sea around you. So I think it is a kind of a constant discussion in British political life, how much should be spent on the defence budget, presumably because at key moments we can't afford everything that we would like to do. But I'm not aware that, I don't think we say, well, that's fine because we'll rely on the states to bail us out. Because of course history so often doesn't work like that. And gosh, we are grateful for the help that we received from the States in the Second World War, but also we recognize that public opinion in the States was not 100% behind joining that conflict. And so why would it be necessarily in the future?
Yeah, that's a fair point. That's a fair point. Okay, enough about that stuff. I want to ask you more about the writing the book itself. By the way, we're talking to Matthew Dennison, who wrote an incredible book called The Queen. If you look at the bottom of the page there, if on the video side, you'll be able to see the link. And if you're on the podcast side, just look in the show notes and you'll be able to get it. It's a 500-page book, so it's thorough. But what part of the book was the most fun for you to write? Or is writing a book a slog? I mean, I know authors who are like iron butters who sit down for 16 hours and just write, go to bed, wake up, iron butted again for 16 hours. What kind of writer are you, and what part was the most enjoyable to write about?
Okay, so I also do that. I start at 9 a.m. and I finish at 1:30, 2 o'clock the next morning. And I take an hour off for lunch, and then I take 3 hours off, drinks time at 6 in the evening, and then to supper, and then I start working at 9 in the evening again. And by the time I finish, my back ached, my head ached, my eyes ached, etc., etc., etc. I'm close to divorce, having said that, there is much that is so rewarding along the way. And this is my 9th book. And unquestionably, this was the most daunting prospect, partly because she is the best known author, huge books been written about her. It's a whoppingly long life. I mean, I found it a terrifying prospect, but exhilarating at other moments. But yeah, frightening. What did I enjoy writing about? I explored her childhood in real depth because I found the childhood charming and wonderful and surprising. There wasn't an aspect I didn't enjoy, except perhaps chronicling the kind of difficult years of marital breakdown in the case of her children, and then the hard times in the 90s.
Yeah, that's also another era that kind of got ushered in, that we're just going to grip on and go on and stay married. That sort of stopped during her reign. That had to be a lot to carry around. And then to try to define what the crown does about that when your family is breaking up and, all this salaciousness. And then having the press covering this salaciousness and making all their money on salacious stories. They don't make their money on, hey, so-and-so got an A on their English paper. Like they make the money on the exciting stuff. Yeah, how does she deal with that, with like all of the negative aspects of? I remember when Alec Baldwin was married to Kim Basinger, he said some really horrible things to his daughter on the answering machine, right? And if we all had the worst things we ever said to our kid recorded and played for the entire world, we would be like, but it also is like we all say things that we're like we regret to our kids because we're humans,
Yeah, I mean, the Queen began her reign inheriting this 19th century concept that somehow the royal family was meant to be exemplary in every way, which is an idea that Victoria and Albert had worked on so hard. mostly to kind of banish the spectre of Queen Victoria's really very dodgy uncles, most of whom, had long-term mistresses, significant numbers of illegitimate children, and lived lives of kind of drunken fun. And Prince Albert thought that simply wasn't good enough, particularly in the aftermath of the French Revolution. So he crafted this concept of monarchy where you had a kind of idealized family on the throne. And of course, that was incredibly effective for Victoria and her family, and so subsequent generations inherited it. And it only really begins to splinter with the divorce of Princess Margaret in the late 1970s, then followed by the divorce of the Queen's children. I mean, the good thing for the monarchy as an institution and us as a nation is that we seem to have reached much more tranquil waters. And I think with hindsight, there are a great many people in Britain who are horrified by the way the press behaved during that difficult decade, because there was just an extraordinary, disreputable, and vulgar scurrilousness to it. And very few people's lives will bear that degree of scrutiny, particularly if you add into this phone hacking and eavesdropping and et cetera, et cetera. Aren't we lucky that the Queen herself emerged untainted?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that there is someone untainted in this horribly tainted world that we all live in. I want to go back into the book a little bit, because if you're going to write a first off, 500 pages, probably not even enough to cover a lady who's 90 years old, who's been as important as she has for as long as that's not even 100 pages per decade. I mean, it's all of a sudden it's not very much. But how much resourcing did you have to do? And then there must be so much competing thought on certain events or certain stories, and he said, she said, times 70 years. How on earth do you sort all that out?
So somewhere along the line, you have to take an editing decision, because the book was commissioned was meant to be at least kind of 60 or 70 pages shorter than it is. By the same token, it could also have been 300 pages longer very easily. I guess the point was that I wanted to have this kind of overarching narrative, this idea of where we were going and what the significance of all of this is for monarchy, and not necessarily what the Queen is saying when she hands a gong to somebody, as what this actually contributes to a kind of template of monarchy. There are conflicting views, but somewhere along the line one has to reach a decision. It's kind of what you do as an author, and the only critical thing is that you ensure that you reach your decision with integrity. I think this is my fourth royal biography. Writing about royals is different from writing about other people, because people remember their encounters with royals unreliably. Invariably, when somebody meets a member of the royal family, particularly the Queen, they're in a highly excitable state. They're deeply revved up by this. And so they don't behave normally. She, of course, is used to it, so she can behave normally. But for the person meeting the Queen, it tends to be a once-in-a-lifetime extraordinary encounter that they remember for years, and it becomes a kind of dinner table conversation or lunch party conversation they dine out on, and it gets polished and polished. And the kernel of truth somehow gets lost in all of this. Or the memories are very extreme. People either bowled over or massively underwhelmed. So you don't get some kind of control experiment anywhere. So you have to kind of navigate through the views you're given. You also have to, I think as a writer on royal things, recognize that sometimes the people who want to speak to you and who want to suggest that they know the most are not as close to the center of power as they want you to think they are. And the people who really are royal confidants wouldn't dream of talking to you, which is why they're royal confidants.
Yeah, hence the title. I don't know if you know Robert Caro's work, but he's written a multi-volume biography of Lyndon Baines Johnson, one of our presidents here in the United States.
Yes, the only one that I've never met.
Yeah, okay, good. Well, how lucky is that? And then, he was taught to every single piece of paper deserves his attention. And he just goes through the entire archives. And I mean, the entire thing is like, this is going to be his life's work. Is someone out there who's going to do that for the Queen, where they're just going to leaf by leaf, note by note, go through the entire thing and make I don't know, that would be like a 20-volume set, but is there someone out there that needs to do that? Or is that done already? Because there have been so many books about who the lady is and how long she's been around.
after the Queen dies, then the palace will commission what's called an official biography, and who those appointed to write that will be given access to the Queen's own papers, and nobody in the Queen's lifetime will gain access to those papers. And if I were in that position, then I would feel, yes, one is obliged to read everything unless it becomes quickly apparent that something is simply a duplication of something else. But I guess that's the legwork that's needed to put in, because when you write nonfiction, there's just always a chance that somebody has scribbled something on the back of a menu. There's a postcard that you find. There's some diary entry that perhaps is atypical, suddenly illuminates something. When I was writing my very first book, which was about the youngest daughter of Queen Victoria, I had this very powerful sense of what it was up, but I had no proof for it. And then suddenly, in a small auction house, I found a series of letters written by a housemaid employed by the exiled Empress Eugenie of France, the widow of Napoleon III, which said exactly what I had thought all along. But I so easily might not have looked in that catalogue, might never have found those letters. So there is gold dust around the corner, potentially always, because that's your eureka moment. And as a biographer, that's what you want. That's part of the excitement.
There's literally a guy in New York City who he is a miner, and there's no better term for it. He goes around and he combs the cracks of the sidewalks. And, as people's jewelry falls apart, as stones fall out, he gathers all of this wealth. Now, it's not like $1 bazillion, but there's literally money in the streets of New York City, and you have to comb through where no one wants that job. He does that and makes a living doing it.
Well, I guess that's sort of what I'm doing, isn't it?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. And so this is what I'm going to ask is, like, if you were commissioned to do this multi-volume set, what kind of commitment is that for you? Is that the last project you take on the rest of your life? Does that take 25 years to do? I mean, to do that right. And then also, how do you do the analysis? I mean, this is a long, long life. You don't just put that in your head. Like, you've got to annotate and, like, really, I mean, would you hire a team of analysts to start really putting this thing together so you can see the whole picture? Or how does that work, man?
Well, I suppose everybody differently. I mean, for me, this book took
wow.
So an official look of the Queen's mother took 9 years. But I think there was either a 7 or a 9 year gap between the Queen Mother's death and publication of William Shawcross's rather wonderful but very long book. The point also is you can't make it take too long because people's appetite for the book goes. People have short memories. Even of the good in the world, people have short memories, and so the appetite for an official life of the Queen will require that whoever is given that Herculean task do their very best to produce it within a time frame. I don't use research assistants because we all interpret things differently. Interpretation is a subjective business, isn't it? Even if one is struggling to be as objective as possible. And I think it becomes a huge, sprawly octopus of a beast, obviously, writing this kind of book when you are just surrounded by, tar blocks of papers. But I think somehow somebody has to be the chief player in order to take responsibility.
Yeah, and there's 100 other ways to do this too, right? Like, there might be the guy that hires the team. There's the guy that does he just feeds paper into the computer and spits out answers. Who knows, right? There's a lot of ways to do this thing. Obviously this book is out. You're promoting it now, but you must have your eye on the next project, because I don't know a single author who writes many books who's like, I don't know what to do next. Like, something next. What's next for you?
I'm finishing a book about Roald Dahl, a children's author.
You write about children's authors. You wrote about Beatrix Potter, right?
Yep, and Kenneth Grahame, the man who wrote The Wind in the Willows. So for me, I have got into a pattern of writing a long book followed by a short book. These long books, like The Queen, require a huge amount of stamina. And I am particularly interested in children's literature that survives. What prompts somebody to become a children's author? What is it that makes a children's book classic? And I'm very happy that that my current editor likes this way of working, that I do long, but then I have this this kind of slight holiday of doing these enjoyable short books. So Roald Dahl at the moment, actually, not nearly as far finished as I might have suggested, but that's what I'm working on.
And then, is there a book about the Queen you would like to write if you were to write another one? Like, oh, it's the Queen and, Harry Truman and their secret relationship via letters or whatever. Is there something out there that you would want to take on next?
No, I mean, I potentially would like to write about the Queen at another point. I'd quite like to have a rest first. And obviously there'd have to be some real, I think it would be self-indulgence on my part if there wasn't some kind of proper imperative, like the discovery of something that rethought or resculpted the story. So maybe, I mean, never say never.
Right. I guess asking this question another way is, what ended up on the cutting room floor that, in those 300 pages that kind of hurt to get rid of?
Well, I don't write multiple drafts of my book. I rewrite as I go along. So by the time I type the end, I've probably written every sentence at least 12 times. So there is stuff that is being rejected along. Here's the deal. For me, if you wrote a book about the Queen, it is very easy for it to be a book about her family. It's very easy for it to be a book about British life. It's very easy for it to be a chronicle of 4 prime ministers. And so my aim always was to try and keep this slightly elusive figure that is the Queen center stage and camera front. And so simply by pushing everybody else into the background as far as was reasonable without distorting the story was inevitably an editing process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Yeah. And then what about the Queen did you learn about that shocked you? Like these, I mean, I know a lot of authors and you guys all have these moments where like this all of a sudden came to me, maybe even after you've written the book, because you have these revelations that happen later on. But what did you learn about the Queen that was most incredible?
I think what I learned was this overwhelming sense of fidelity to her immediate forebears. I think what I hadn't realized is the pressure on her from childhood to conform to an inherited pattern, and this idea once it became clear that she was likely to be Queen, that she would exercise no choice in the way that she went about it, that she would do the sensible thing, which was to model herself on her father and her grandfather. And I think it's an extraordinary thing that she accepted that curtailment of choice in a life that involves such limited freedom of choice anyway. She embraced this overarching restriction of choice, which was to do it the way that was expected of her. It's interesting for us, isn't it? Because we live at a time where choice is elevated as the ultimate human right. There is nothing in our lives which we don't feel we have a right. And yet the Queen has a very little right of choice. I think it probably helps that she is fundamentally a modest person, and so would incline, certainly as a young woman, would have inclined to take the advice that she was given and acknowledge that other people perhaps knew better.
And I guess one more real quick question, and it's kind of a big question, but I just realized I have no idea. When her uncle abdicates, that changes her life completely. She was whatever life she was going to have, and who knows, she was young enough that maybe it wasn't too mapped out, but it changes inexorably the moment he abdicates, right? And she becomes this new thing, which is part not human, part crown, part little girl. What was her life just the weeks before that was even a notion that might happen? What kind of person was she going to be when she grew up?
Well, it's interesting. If you look at any kind of account of her childhood, she emerges as this incredibly vibrant, dazzling child. I mean, the fact that the Duke and Duchess of Windsor called her Shirley Temple, well, there is a reason for that. It's not only that she was globally famous as a small child in the way that she was as a screen actress. It's the fact that as a tiny child, she had this kind of glittering charisma. So what didn't change in the Queen's life is that she was a figure of significant interest, adulation, press obsession from the cradle, because she was the only royal grandchild. So her aunt had given birth to 2 sons, but they were not royal because she had married a non-royal sister. So when the Queen comes home, she's the only princess in her generation. So she's always a figure of astonishing interest. So the kind of goldfish world dimension of her life doesn't change in 37. What changes is that suddenly she is treading a path from which there is no escape. Because I think there's always an understanding that her parents, who were young enough to have more children, probably wouldn't have any more children. She did understand what it meant for her. Insofar as any 10-year-old can, she knows that it means she will be the queen after her father. Of course, she has no idea really what that implies or infers. So, but I suspect that was less traumatic for her than for her parents, because she could then be brought up to be the queen, whereas her father had been brought up to be the spare, not the heir.
Yeah, that's a big transition for him too. And I suppose if you're a religious person like she is, because she is the church, you have to kind of look back and go, this is providence. This is God's design. He built this little person equipped to handle this. And or am I making too big of a leap there?
I don't know to what extent she feels that. I mean, she certainly feels that her coronation vows are binding, are promise made to God. But what is interesting for us at this moment in time is that when the Queen became queen in 1952, 30% of people in Britain polled believed that it was God's will that she was. So a third of the population felt that this wasn't an accident, but was some kind of divine providence. And surely some of that would have rubbed off on her. I don't think she's egotistical enough to necessarily believe in herself the way that Stuart monarchs in the 17th century as divinely ordained. But I think she thinks she has made binding and sacred promises to do her best.
I mean, it has worked out as if there was some kind of intelligent, providential, plan. But again, who knows? Who knows? It is just interesting looking back in retrospective. Hey, anything in closing? We've done this for about an hour. I don't want to keep it too long, but any closing thoughts?
I feel we're immensely lucky because what we have, and I guess people recognize this in other sovereigns across the globe, and I think in other countries recognize this in the Queen, is that you have somebody who embodies the concept of others before self. And ultimately, maybe that is her most powerful gift to the nation, that we value self-determinism as a society. People value the idea to have control over their own lives, to try and seize their own destiny. But actually, it's immensely powerful to have somebody saying, I'm not interested in me, I'm interested in you, I'm interested in us. So I think we've been phenomenally lucky and great.
No, I agree. Yeah, you're right. Others before self is easy. We often focus on the other stuff first. So I appreciate that. Hey, thank you for coming on, Matthew. I'd love to have you back on again to talk about more of your books at any time. It's just so great to talk to someone who's so versed in the knowledge or in the topic that they've written about. It's just fantastic. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. And the book comes out in the States in September.
Okay, in September, everybody. If you can get it on pre-sales on Amazon, there's that link right there for sure. Go check it out. I know you're going to love it.